Welcome, Ghosties, to episode 95 of the Ghost Lads podcast. Today, we sat down with John Marcantoni Rosa, the playwright of Puerto Rican Nocturne, which is going to be opening at the Bug on August 5th. We discussed his heritage, legacy, toxic masculinity, and how it seeps into almost everything these days. And the importance in telling both sides, I think, comes out quite clear. Remember, folks, focus on being an elder. Now, Dan, give us War by the Hypnotic Brass Ensemble. Without further ado, welcome to episode 95 of the Ghost Lads podcast. Today's guest is John Marcantoni Rosa. Is that correct? Am I saying it right?
Yes. Yeah,
Awesome.
you pronounce it better than most.
Oh, I appreciate it. I wanted to make sure I didn't butcher it too badly. Playwright in town. The play right now that you have produced, it's in the works, soon to open, is Puerto Rican Nocturne.
Yes.
Tell me about this play. What inspired it?
So the play is about the Sierra Maravilla murders, or really the aftermath of them. The situation in Puerto Rico, as some know and some may not know, is that the U.S. Invaded Puerto Rico at the end of the 19th century in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. They've occupied Puerto Rico ever since. The first 50 years of the occupation, Puerto Rico was under military dictatorship that was entirely run by American generals. And then in 1948, Puerto Rico was granted some degree of self-governance, which led to its current status as the Estado Libre, which means a free state. It was meant to be a much more equitable relationship. It never became that, however. And it started in the aftermath in 1950. There was a revolution in Puerto Rico led by in Puerto Rico, we use the term nationalist different than the term gets used here in the U.S. We're independentistas. We want our country to be free. And so there was a nationalist uprising led by Pedro Albizu Campos, kind of the most famous independence leader. And the response to that was to give Puerto Rico a level of autonomy, but in all actuality, it was a colony. It remained a colony, just with local governance. And in 1978, there was the independence movement started gaining traction again, particularly amongst college students and other young people. And the FBI, along with the help of the San Juan and Puerto Rico police departments, infiltrated a lot of these groups using undercover agents. More often than not, they were recruited in high school. There was a very big anti-communist bent to this whole operation, this being the Cold War. The Cold War in Puerto Rico had particular significance because of the Cuban Revolution. So basically, the United States, part of why they treated Cuba the way they did after its revolution was to scare Puerto Rico and keep it from trying to get independence. So it was basically, look what we're doing to Cuba, we can do this to you too. And so a lot of anti-communist fervor. This one cop who was a high school recruit, he was recruited when he was 16. His name was Alejandro González Malave. He not only was a staunch anti-communist, his father very much wanted to be an American and raised González Malave to see himself as an American and not as a Puerto Rican, and in fact to see Puerto Ricans as subhuman. So even though he was born and raised as a Puerto Rican, he definitely had a very self-hating complex. And when he was recruited, he actually told the recruiter that he'd be willing to do this work for free, and also that independentistas don't deserve to live. Mm. And the guy still recruited him. And then 4 years later, he, in an attempt really to try to boost his career, but also there was definitely something very personal about it for him. He and González Malave was very successful as an undercover agent. Mm. And so he was pretty well known in the department he was in, and that he was tied to. And he convinced a group of cops, 10 in total, it ended up being. He actually only told like 3 guys, and then they got a bunch of other people because they were like, oh, we could do this and it'll be good for our careers. Hmm. And they ambushed the activists who operated under González Malave. González Malave had become the leader of a small cell of about five activists. And originally there were going to be 5 victims. 3 of them ended up dropping out at the last minute that day, and it ended up just being 2. Hmm. One of them a teenager. And the cops not only executed them, they also beat them severely. And the coroner's report was that had they not been shot, they would have died just from the beating. And in the aftermath, they tried to sell the story that it was in self-defense. They said that the activists shot first, that they were armed. And then that story quickly fell apart. And that was the beginning of a 14-year odyssey of trials and scandals and a bunch of interrelated conflicts that came up, that many of them only like slightly relating to the murders themselves, but they still got thrown in with everything else. And as for the question of why I wanted to tell this story, mm-hmm. I grew up going back and forth between the States and the island. Mm-hmm. I've always been very strong. I always had a very strong connection to my Puerto Ricanness. And you know, me and my brother were one of the few American cousins, the cousins that grew up in the U.S., who learned Spanish, and we made the culture very central to our lives. And I've always identified as Puerto Rican, you know, first, second, third, and last. And I'm also a huge history buff, and so. These events like Cerro Maravilla, I was always interested in dramatizing. But the specific reason why I did this story was in 2012, the first book that I wrote that got me international attention was a book called The Feast of San Sebastian. And there's a minor but important character in that book named Adria. Mm-hmm. And I used the Cerro Maravilla murders and her being the mother of one of the victims as a plot point in that book. Yeah. And the whole thing was that she was this former activist who has gone into sort of a self-exile in this neighborhood called La Perla, which is a very infamous slum in Puerto Rico. And when I was doing events for the book in New York, because I got brought under the wing of this writer named Nelson Dennis. He had a really big book at the time called War Against All Puerto Ricans. And he advocated for my book. That's why I was able to get the notice that I got for it. And so I was doing a reading event in New York City, and a few readers came up to me and they wanted to know about Adria's past. And they were like, oh, are you ever going to do a sequel or I guess prequel to this? And that was like the initial seed. But then when I started researching it, and it was originally going to be a book, I was struck by a few things, and particularly that the women of this story are pretty much excluded in all of the reporting and the research. Like there's just 100% focus on the men. And González Malave was married at the time of the murders. And a 20-year-old being married in 1978 Puerto Rico wasn't unusual. But he was married. The woman he was married to, he met at an independentista party. And she was a part of the whole groups and all. And the only thing that I could find about her was that he apparently in the aftermath convinced her to take a job as a secretary at the precinct he worked at, which I thought was a really peculiar detail. And then within a year, she had divorced him. And the thing is that all of the cops throughout Puerto Rico knew what the real story was before anyone else did. And there's a crazy side story, which I'd be happy to get into later, where basically a cop held a press conference where he said, "Oh, I'll tell you about the real story of Sergio Maravilla." And so there was a lot of holes that were being poked publicly. But clearly she heard what the real story was. He had been bullshitting her, and she walked out. Like that was just clear as day. But like nobody really focused on that. And I was like, this is so incredibly fascinating what it would be to be the spouse of this person. You've been with them for 4 years and you thought they were this one way. And it not only turns out that they're a completely different person, they have completely different beliefs. They also killed 2 people.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for you? Because you fall under that category too, of people that they disagree with. And that must have been terrifying. I was like, why wasn't anyone interested in this? But then also with the character of Adria, the thing that really excited me about her was she, in order for her to have the future in the book that I wrote, it would mean that she would have to reject all attempts to try to turn this into a cause, into protesting what happened to her son. She flees it. She goes into exile. And we live in a time where kind of like activism is so very central. And when something bad happens, like you're supposed to turn it into something empowering and inspiring. And that's not her. She goes her own route. And I thought that would be a really interesting character to write, who just pretty much every single time that she gets pushed in a certain direction, she rejects it because she has to make her own path.
Yeah.
And I really saw, and I don't want to give away what happens to González Malave, as that's central to the story, but I saw pretty quickly that there was a clear contrast between these 2 characters, of a person who begins the story with no power and ends it with power, and a person who begins the story with power and ends it without power. And following those 2 courses, I quickly realized that Adria and Gonzo were the most interesting characters to me from all of the scandals and everything. And that a play was the best way of telling that story.
Yeah. Who do you find yourself connected to the most? I feel like there's a fighter's spirit in you as you're talking now, and I wonder where you saw that being reflected the most out of those 2 people. I feel, especially
more and more, and given some things that have happened to me in the last couple of years, I feel a lot like Adria a lot of days. That it's hard to find reasons to fight or to think that the things you do matter. And I've always been drawn to rebels, and I've always been drawn to people who just don't follow the company line, and so I relate to her a lot. But there's also a lot of cynicism and anger that I relate to in Gonzo sometimes, and I mean that's the that's the part of oneself you don't always want to admit, but it's like sometimes this world just makes you furious. And I don't agree with anything that Gonzo says and does, but I understand the anger that he feels.
You understand his motivations?
Yeah, because I mean, his motivations really were to get recognized. He wanted to be seen, and he really felt he was doing something heroic and noble. And that sort of misguided heroism, I think, is especially prevalent amongst men. You're definitely kind of raised to, especially Latino men, we're raised to always kind of be on a mission, and to kind of be the center of attention and larger than life, or at least that's how I was raised. But maybe my family was just really dramatic.
Did you talk about this this male expectation, this traditionalized expectation for what men are supposed to be? Do you find yourself bucking against that regularly, if at all?
Oh, absolutely.
Or did that something come on later?
No, absolutely. I mean, I used to get teased about it when I was a little kid, because my brother's a very like hyper masculine macho type, and I was always the sensitive, creative one. And I got involved in theater very young. When I was 6, I started taking acting classes, and there's always been something kind of effeminate about me, and I embrace that feminine energy in myself. And my kind of take on masculinity is that the version of masculinity we're in now is this very ultra repressed reaction to homophobia. Before the gay rights movement really caught on, before Stonewall, men were very cultured, and it was like totally acceptable for a man to dance and sing and wear nice clothes and be obsessed about their hair and their their colognes and their style. And men were, in a lot of ways, like if you look at depictions of men, particularly in like the 40s and 50s, there was a lot of femininity in that. And then I feel like once gay culture started becoming more prevalent, you had this class of men in this country, which is already, a puritanical country, as we all know. They're just like, no, we can't be those cultured effettes, and we have to be Neanderthals, we have to be just like the most base qualities of a man. And I think that's what's really defined masculinity ever since. And it's a fucking shame. I'm sorry, can I curse?
Oh, you can absolutely cuss
okay.
on there. It's totally fine.
Yeah, it's just a huge shame. Men, we're our own worst enemies, and the worst part about it is that when we give in to our worst tendencies, the people we hurt the most are women, and also our children too, and I don't think men realize how destructive those base tendencies are, So I've always pushed back against that. I've always found it reprehensible.
Do you find any of, I mean, through that idea of men kind of being afraid to relinquish their hold on those basic tenets of what they think manhood to be, do you find that is a major theme in your description of Gonzo in the play?
Yeah, and I mean, not just this work. I mean, also past works of mine.
Mm-hmm.
I've been very concerned about the way men move in the world and portray themselves and how they treat others. Um, Gonzo, Gonzo to me was always a portrait of a boy trying to be a man,
Mm-hmm.
being that he, you get recruited when you're 16 years old to be an undercover cop. You're given this immense amount of power at an age where you're already a cocky little shit. And then on top of it, like, you have actual power.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was in high school, I actually knew an undercover cop, and he hung out with the theater kids, and he, it was always very strange. I mean, it was very cocksure and very obnoxious, incredibly obnoxious, because he felt like he could get away with anything,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember he had a police light, like a little portable one that you could put on the dashboard, and he would like turn it on along with like the siren so that he could speed and get away with it and like cut through red lights and all, like a teenager would, right?
Some grown ass cops do that now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So he was very boastful and would just like tease people relentlessly, and there were stories that apparently he didn't like taking no for an answer from women either, that he'd get really like not violent with them, but definitely like kind of berate them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a guy I really did not like very much.
Mm-hmm.
But then, on the other hand, whenever there would be raids in the school, like you'd be like going to the bathroom, you pass by and you'd be like, hey, don't go to that bathroom, go to the other one. There's about to be some cops there. Or I remember one time he told a bunch of us at a rehearsal, like, hey, tomorrow you might want to show up to school late. And it was because like there was a huge raid of a bunch of students' lockers and stuff like that. And so, like when you hear things like that, you're kind of like grateful that the guy's on your side a little, but he's still a reprehensible prick. So I had some experience with someone like that in writing Gonzo, and what really stood out to me was a lack of identity. He has no self, and that's something I talked to Diego, the actor who plays him, Diego Estrada. I told him like he is always most at home when he's not himself. And so like when he's interacting with his wife and she's trying to like pinpoint who he is exactly, he doesn't know who he is. He never developed that sense of self. Aside from cop, I'm just a cop, but I'm a cop who lies. I'm a cop who lies a lot, and so to go back to the thing with masculinity, I think that there's a hole that's in a lot of men when they're trying to put on the suit of masculinity that society hands them, and it doesn't fit them quite right.
Yeah.
And I think I think that's where a lot of the younger generation trying to break up and break down gender norms has some origin, and I think they're probably dealing with it in a much healthier way than my generation did, and previous ones, because so many people just don't fit that mold. And it's also a mold that was like designed decades ago in a very different world than the one that we live in. And I don't think that men in general are being brought up for the world as it is. They're being brought up in a world that not only no longer exists, but even when it did exist, didn't exist in the way that it does in their mythology. You know, where like if a man wants something, he just gets it. Like it was never really that way, but there's a sense that like, oh, but a guy could just get away with anything. And it's like, oh, that's not really the reality.
Yeah.
But once you hang on to that mythology, when the world doesn't represent what you thought it was always supposed to be, there's that feeling of betrayal. And I think that especially a lot of young men feel that way. You know, it's like, oh, I thought I should be able to get a girl's attention, or I should be able to get a job really easy.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I think also that gets compounded by a sense in America that the best times are long in the past. And like, oh, you know, my father or my grandfather or my great grandfather, they were able to make something out of nothing. And now, like, what do I have? You know, like there's a gutted manufacturing base. There's these low paying jobs that expect a whole ton from you. There's, you know, maybe you don't want to go to college. Maybe college isn't the thing for you. And it's like, well, where do I go? And you don't have somebody in your life who can be like, hey, there's actually a lot of options for you. All right. There's tech schools. There's, you know, taking up a trade. There's something for you. And they don't have that guidance. And that feeling of being lost, I mean, it leads to extremism. And that's what we're seeing today. And I think Gonzo was the same way, that he was promised a certain experience when he was infiltrating these groups. He was really promised like a James Bond movie, basically. It's like you're going undercover and these are dangerous people. And then, you know, he gets into these groups, and for the most part, it's a bunch of like, you know, 20-something college students who, you know, half of them are probably there because they're trying to pick up somebody. And, you know, like the politics is like secondary. And even for the most fervent people, they're not criminals. And what he was expecting was criminals. He was expecting killers. And one of the things that, you know, that media depicts is kind of like violence is very common. And in fact, violence isn't common. And the people who commit violence are a stark minority of people actually will commit violence, and particularly kill people. You know, that's not an easy thing to do. And so he goes into this environment thinking that he's about to go into a John Wayne Western. And instead he finds, oh, it's just a bunch of meetings and speeches and we sit around and don't do much. Where's the action? You know, do you ever see Heat?
Oh, yeah.
Heat. Yeah. You know, where's the juice? Give me the juice, you know?
Man, for me, the action is the juice, John.
Yes, the action is the juice. Yes, that's it. That's it.
Tom Sizemore at his best.
yeah, before things went south for him.
Yeah.
But yeah, like that's what he was wanting, and I think when in reality didn't match that expectation, he did something incredibly reckless, irresponsible, and painful to a lot of other people. And really, his actions, if they weren't as destructive as they were, because this event like reverberates in Puerto Rico to today. It's 44 years later. Still gets talked about. There's still repercussions from it. And it was honestly the act of a stupid, reckless kid. And if it wasn't that destructive, it would be absurd what he did and how he did it.
Yeah. I was going through some of the pages in preparation of this, and I found, without giving anything away, the last moment of this play to be very, I mean, intense. It's beautiful, and the way I feel like you sum up the play. That's what I was trying to get to. What are some of your hopes in terms of what people take away from this experience, both as a performer in it and the people that come to see it?
You know, from the performance angle, I wrote this play being that I grew up an actor, and kind of got into playwriting because me and my friends didn't like the kind of roles that we were getting as teenagers. So it was like, hey, write our own roles. I really put a lot of emphasis on making sure that every character in the play has a big moment. Every actor in this play, no matter how small their role is, they get to steal the show for a little bit. And I think that people are going to find, and I've already seen it in the rehearsals. Noemi, our director, has gotten some amazing performances out of this cast, and I want to say all but one, maybe two of the actors have done a lot of plays with Su Teatro, but they haven't gotten many opportunities outside of Su Teatro. And I think this is a play that for those actors, it'll be able to show the audiences here in Denver that they're capable of a lot. They have a lot of tools in their toolbox and a lot of ability, and I hope it opens up even more opportunities for them. Not that Su Teatro doesn't give them some good opportunities, but you know, as an actor, you don't want to just stay stagnant in one place. You want to try out new things, and I'm excited to see how people respond to their performances.
Nice, wonderful. For you, is there any? The word I'm looking for is like any connection you find in terms of your legacy through this piece and the subsequent pieces you've written around it? Is there something that you're exercising through that or discovering even now through multiple texts on
it? Well, I'm 38. I don't know how much I want to like think about legacy just yet.
Yeah.
But no, my writing. The biggest thing that I want people to take away from my writing, is my books, because of a dispute with my previous publishers, all of my books are out of print. But my short stories and articles and things like that, and some chapter excerpts from these books, they're online in a lot of different venues, such as Across the Margin and Minor Lits and places like that. Pank Magazine, another one. Yeah. But so you can read my work. You can Google me, find it. But the biggest takeaway that I would want people to have is, even though I write about Puerto Ricans a lot in my work, I love writing about my people. I love writing about our culture. That the stories also are very universal, and even more so that these are stories that try on a lot of different hats. I've tried a lot of different genres. I'm not trying to tell the same old stories. I'm not trying to imitate any other Latin American or Latino writer. I'm following my own path and writing the kind of stories I want to write. Some of them are crime fiction, some of it's comedies, some of it's surreal, quasi-fantastical kind of work. Some of it's very experimental. This play is very experimental. You know, I borrowed a lot from Samuel Beckett in this play, particularly the short play of his called Play. Which if anybody listening out there wants to check it out on YouTube, if you type in Play Anthony Minghella, he was the director of it. He also directed English Patient, Talented Mr. Ripley. In, I think it was 2000, he did a short film with Alan Rickman and Kristen Scott Thomas, and their heads are in jars. They're sticking out of jars. They're covered in mud. And it's there's another actress, but she's less well known, another British actress. And play is 3 dueling monologues said at high speed, and the monologue goes for 5 minutes and then it repeats. And the second time it repeats, the text deteriorates. Like some of the lines start being cut off halfway. It becomes more and more distorted. And it's the story of an affair. This man cheats on his wife finds out, and it's about the disintegration of their marriage and the aftermath. But it's all told in this hyperkinetic fashion. And there's a scene in this play, the circus scene, which is the last scene in Act 1, where I do a dueling monologue, and I do it in the style that Samuel Beckett does it. Nice. And that was incredibly fun to write. But, you know, being that I used to work in the publishing sphere, I used to have a publishing house for a time. One of the big frustrations that I had with Latino writers was them not breaking out of the box that the white establishment put them in. And I was always like, you know, I want non-immigration, non-identity stories. There's too many of them, and they're actually not very interesting subjects. Mm-hmm. You can only say so much about immigration. You know, you can only say so much about identity until it just becomes like the same story again and again. So, you know, I think I said when I launched the company, it was an interview I did where I said, if I could find a writer who wrote a Peruvian monster story where like the monster is like from these old Indian myths, mm-hmm. I think that would be amazing for one thing. And I would want to represent a book like that. I want to represent books that push genre, that create their own genres. And I mean, and this is one of the things of reading a lot of books. And most of the books that I read aren't books from the US, they're from elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And when I read books from around Latin America, there's no limits because they don't have this nonsense from the American publishing industry. Like they're just telling their stories. And it's liberating to see that. And I wish that more Latino writers would stop looking within, looking within the US. Like look outside. You have these homelands with amazing cultures and amazing histories, amazing literature, amazing art. Like connect with it. The US is not the be all end all. It's one country in a world of almost 200 countries, mm-hmm. you know? And I encourage that of everyone, no matter who you are, like be a person of the world. And so to not veer too far from your question, you know, when people read my work, I don't want them to be like, oh yeah, he's just like every other Puerto Rican writer. He's just like any other Latino writer. Mm-hmm. It's like, this is just a good fucking writer. And he infuses his culture. His culture is definitely there, but he will do anything. He'll tell any kind of story. And I never know what I'm going to get when I check out John Marcantoni. You know, that's what I want people to say.
Absolutely. John, I'm really interested to hear about what were some of your influences, the things that inspired you to pick up a pen and look at performance.
Oh man, there's so many great writers. You know, and one of my biggest influences is Hubert Selby Jr., who you might not have heard of his name, but you've probably heard of either Last Exit to Brooklyn or Requiem for a Dream. Oh, yeah, and those are both books of his. He was a very daring, very experimental writer. His writing style is completely unique. I mean, even though there's a lot of writers that do stream of consciousness, but he had a whole orthography of the way that he structured his stories, the way he structured his dialogue and his narrative. Everything ran together, but you could always tell when he was doing one or the other. He kind of did very unorthodox punctuation and things like that, that really immersed you in the writing, because his stories, his style, it made you feel like you were on the streets with these characters, and made you feel like you were in their heads, and going through the struggles that they were going through. And he very often wrote about the underprivileged, the misfits of society, the outcasts. His first book, Last Exit to Brooklyn, was actually banned in the U.S. for several years. Wow. And Allen Ginsberg helped him through a lawsuit with that went all the way up to the Supreme Court to get it unbanned. But the reason it was banned is because it portrayed gay and transsexual relationships, and portrayed them in a humanistic way, and not like making them monsters or anything, Yeah. And this being the 1950s, of course, that wasn't going to fly. And he always wrote from a place of empathy, and that was his biggest thing. Was, even if I'm writing the most cruel, monstrous character, I want you to empathize with them. And that always became a coda for me. And his style, like I mentioned before, was just very kinetic. And that's the kind of writing I've been attracted to, whether it's like Elmore Leonard or Richard Price, where it's like it's dialogue that just hops off the page. And then, with plays, I mean, Beckett, O'Neill, the great classics, but probably Tennessee Williams the most of anyone. Just in that he, the man wrote melodramas. Like, he wrote some over-the-top melodramas that you could just change them to Spanish in their telenovelas, Yeah. So Southern Gothic is not that far removed from it. But he was also creating these indelible, unforgettable characters who were grounded in a kind of vulnerable humanity that I don't think a lot of writers today, no matter who they are, I don't think that they're as open to being. A lot of writers try to stay away from vulnerable, over-the-top characters. They want characters who are cool. They want characters who are stoic, who are oftentimes quip machines. It's just a one-liner after one-liner after one-liner. Or they're just characters that don't have a lot of imperfections. And what I like about the writers of the 50s and 60s was they really embraced the imperfections of their characters, and then from Latin America and Spain, I mean, Cervantes did it all in Don Quixote, he was doing styles of writing that hadn't even been born yet. He even has a dream sequence in Don Quixote where he uses almost Freudian logic to dissect this dream. Yeah. And it's 300 years before Freud is even born. I mean, the man was a genius, but I really think it was writing without any sort of limitations. And whether writers are going through an MFA program, or so many writers get stuck in the hell that is academia, or they get stuck in this sort of like high society world of writing that's very staid and very much in a bubble. The sort of white progressive trope of these sort of like wealthy writers who all want to feign some sort of victimization, even though they're like living off of a trust fund. And even in theater, there's a real push toward playwriting that is standardized in some sort of way, that it's like, this is the way you write dialogue, this is the way you write a scene, this is the way you structure a play, this is the way you format a play. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's good to know your basics, it's good to know the skeleton of things when you're just learning it, but so many writers won't even go beyond that skeleton. They won't even push the bounds of what they can possibly do. And I think that because MFA programs and and writing programs, whether they're theatrical or literary, they've become so predominant in culture.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of ways, they become professionalized. And people can build up careers around them, that we forget how new they are. They're completely new. Like in 1984, when I was born, there were hardly any MFA programs. Mm-hmm. And there was Iowa Writers Workshop, and that was about it. Or maybe like a writing class at Berkeley or a writing class at NYU. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, you didn't have that shit. And that was within my lifetime. And the writers who existed before that, and this is also why reading non-American writers is really important. And I want to mention a couple of them, but like there used to be a freedom to how you express yourself and a freedom to how you tell stories. Whereas now you tell a story that resonates with another person that they love. And that should be all that matters. But then you show it to another person and they're like, this isn't the way that you write. This isn't the way you do this. This is the way you do that. And it's like, based on what? It's like, well, it was based on this book I read. Well, like, I don't give a shit. I never read that book. Yeah. What do I care what that person has to say? But I had that experience where the book I mentioned before, Thesis and Sebastian, Nelson Dennis is a New York Times bestselling writer. He has the hottest book in the Latino sphere at that time. And he loves my fucking book, and he writes a review for it, puts it into Latino Rebels, puts it in a bunch of other news sites, and is just praising me. And I'm feeling on top of the world. The same day that happens, I had submitted the book to another reviewer, this Twitter book blogger. I don't even remember their name. And that person contacted me the same day that his review went out. His glowing review goes out. And she told me that she couldn't make it to the second page because I clearly don't know how to write. And that is like that's the artistic experience in a nutshell. But God. I mean, obviously, like this person was like this self-published nobody. I'm going to go with the best-selling author in his opinion. But also, there are so many people who wouldn't go that track. There are so many people who would just hold on to like that negative feedback and be like, no, that's the problem with me. I need to like rein back my style. I need to rein back my voice. And I feel that's the wrong impulse. I mean, criticism, absolutely essential. This play, we actually just changed the scene last night. It's a week before the premiere. We just changed this whole scene. And that's the beauty of theater, is that collaboration, that openness. But there's good criticism and there's bad criticism. But to go back, because I do just want to mention these Latin American writers, Julio Cortés was a huge influence on me. He was an Argentinian writer who spent his time going back and forth between Argentina and France. But he wrote a book called Rayuela, which means hopscotch. And the book is written like a game of hopscotch, where at the end of the chapter, it'll say, so like, a hopscotch, like you have all these numbers and you might jump from number 1 to number 4. And that's what he does with the chapters, and he has you not only jump ahead in chapters, but he also has, so the book is broken up into 3 parts, and there's 2 different narratives. And then the third one are alternate scenes. They're alternate scenes of what you had just read in that chapter, but from another character's point of view. Wow. And or he changes like the entire tone, like it's a dramatic scene and then becomes comedic. And this book is a classic. It's also massive. It's like almost 1,000 pages long. But it's just a fun, inventive book that if he had gone through an MFA program, they would have told him, oh no, that'll never be published. Yeah. And this is why you don't go through those things. But finally, the last person I want to mention is just Juan Jose Sayer, who his book El Entenado is like probably the most influential book I've ever read. and it's also an Argentinian book, and it's this examination of this young boy during the conquista, the conquest of the Americas. He's a cabin boy on a Spanish galleon that ends up in Argentina, and when they land, this Native American tribe kills all of them and kidnaps him, and he stays with them for 10 years, and then he ends up going back to Spain. And he spends the rest of the book trying to analyze this culture that he just experienced, because what these people in this tribe do is they kidnap the people around them like once a year, have them witness this like insane cannibalistic orgy, and then they keep them for a few months more, and outside of that ceremony, this culture is completely repressed. And it's very like super organized. You would never know that people have sex until you see a woman is pregnant. They're very like prude and refined. And what he ends up figuring out is that essentially this tribe is hyper aware of the fact that nature can consume them at any time, and that they can devolve into chaos at any time, and that they are subject to this planet that surrounds them that can destroy them at any moment. And they're also subject to their worst base impulses. And so they have this ceremony once a year to remind them of what would happen if they don't keep their shit together, if they don't keep an orderly society. And the reason why they get their neighbors is because they believe themselves to be the superior culture. And they see themselves as like the beacon of humanity. And they're trying to educate their neighbors on what they know. and let them go back to like spread the gospel kind of thing. And the book becomes like a contrast where basically Western civilization is exactly like this tribe, just this tribe is a microcosm of our civilization. And that instead of a cannibalistic orgy, we have wars. And wars are what remind us that, hey, at any moment we can devolve into chaos, you know. But what Western civilization lacks is the regard for nature and the regard for the natural world, and the fact that we're subject to it and not the other way around.
Yeah.
So that book like impacts me every day. I think of it.
That's really interesting. Like, at first, when you were describing it, it's like The Purge before Ethan Hawke, but it's actually, it seems much deeper than that. It's almost as if they're trying to take control of the chaos just once.
Right.
Yeah. Like to give in to all that. That's really quite powerful.
Yeah.
You've
yeah,
talked,
and there's a
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there is an English translation of the book called The Witness. If you ever want to check it out. And it's a short book. It's like 180 pages, but it's amazing what they do with it.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that one really jumps out at me. I might check that out for sure. You've talked about your journey from a professional standpoint as this artist, this author. You've kind of been thrown obstacles to your own voice, and we've been in communication on Instagram talking about some really like close to your heart kind of concepts. One of the questions I have from those side conversations and speaking with you now is, where do you find yourself the most free in your artistry and as yourself?
Oh, yeah. That's a much deeper question. You know, I'll answer the artistry part second, because it's more difficult. But personally, where I feel most like of myself, you know, I'm a father. My kids are the center of my world, and I feel most grounded with them. my cats also. they're my fur children. Mm-hmm. But I also feel very grounded in myself in urban environments, because there's like a buzz and energy to urban environments that speaks to me and energizes me. But then also I'm a beach kid, man. I'm a beach boy. I love the fucking beach. I love the coast and the colors of the sunsets and rises, the sound of the ocean, I mean, in Puerto Rico, the mountains go all the way up to the water. Yeah. And exploring nature and feeling that connection there. But I'm one of those people, like, I need a balance of the two, but I definitely lean a little more towards cities. Mm-hmm. But it's just it's an experience in life, man. It's like, so some days I just want to stay at home and cook, and cooking's another thing I really love. But I want to cook and just like hang out in my house. Other days I want to be out. I want to explore my neighborhood, explore the city, go to the mountains, whatever. I really love being with people. I love talking to people and making new friends and having relationships with people, and like that sort of interconnectedness. It really feeds me a lot, and I feel like that complements the writing aspect, which is I feel like you need a connection to the world you live in order to be a good writer, because your characters need to come from this place of truth, and yourself is oftentimes not the greatest barometer of truth. We carry with ourselves a lot of baggage, a lot of attachments, a lot of false perceptions and ideas about ourselves and also about others. And we need that interchange with someone else to get outside of our own heads and outside of our own egos, and that's, I mean, the Buddha in the Heart Sutra, when he talks about, that you by yourself are nothing. You are nothing until you connect to another person or another thing. You only exist in relation to something else, mm-hmm. because you by yourself are just a floating ego. And until you give back to the world around you, all you're doing is feeding that ego. Yeah. So I meditate on those things, and those things center me. The artistic sphere I've really struggled with the last few years. And I was just talking to my lady about this the other day. She's another person who grounds me, but she's shy. She wouldn't want me talking about that. But that's for offline.
I got you.
But no, like, artistically, we were talking about this the other day. Like, I got to experience in the publishing world. I got to experience a certain level, working with people, representing writers, getting my own work out there, and I walked away from all of it. And theater, like basically, I got into the literary world because I became a father when I was 22. And my ex-wife was not very supportive of me doing theater. Mm-hmm. And so writing books was a way of, and working in publishing was a way of getting around that. Mm-hmm. I could write at any time. I could write when the kids are in bed. I don't have to be in a theater for 8 hours, and yet, like, I just missed the stage. I missed it incredibly. And I experienced some loss. I lost some people a few years ago, and that kind of brought me back to theater. But also Hurricane Maria brought me back to theater too, because I have some New York friends asked me to write a short piece for a fundraiser they were doing for the island. And that experience made me turn Puerto Rican Nocturne into a play, when it had been a book up until then. But it was, with the dissolution of my marriage, with losing a very good friend of mine, and also with butting my head up against this wall that I felt, where all these writers who I represented never got over a certain hump. And all these projects that I worked on never got the recognition that they deserved. And where I felt like I'm screaming into a void, all the different things with the arts world, particularly the literary world, is stagnant. Everybody's just in a circle, patting themselves on the back, like they're looking at each other as opposed to looking out at the world around them. They're not branching out, and the whole scene had just become stale and dull. And the most they could come up with was like, well, hey, let's find some Black and brown writers who we can also make stale and dull. And take off all their edges and make them the most boring version of us being white people. And I was like, this isn't me. This isn't my thing. Where do I find grounding in this? And, you mentioned we had talked on Instagram and stuff, and I posted something today that I mentioned to you, where I said that the literary world and the theater world, the good things about them are different, but the bad things are the same. I mean, racism, classism, especially classism, the kind of regional cattiness that happens at times, the sort of tribalism that occurs in a lot of those groups, the short-term thinking, those things affect both worlds. But the biggest difference between theater and literary world is, in theater, community is not a word. In theater, community is a real fucking thing.
Yeah.
And when people talk about like their castmates and people they've worked with and the companies that have meant the world to them, like they go above and beyond for those people, and they look out for each other. And that sort of connectedness and that sort of selflessness, not that there isn't selfishness in the theater world, but there's a whole lot of selflessness. There's a whole lot of compassion and charity that go on, that in the literary world is just lip service. There's no real community. It's people looking out for themselves, and you only matter to them as long as you can get them published somewhere. And theater is what I needed. That community is what I needed. Even, the journey of this play, and we don't have to go into all of it because it's a lot, but, it was supposed to be produced in 2020. Of course, pandemic canceled it, like so many other productions. And, now this production that we have now, I'm one of the producers. I'm doing all the marketing, but I have a director who's bringing an amazing vision to it. Our stage manager, Veronica, Straight Lingo, who's so talented, and I believe you know her as well. She's wonderful.
Yeah. She's great. She's great.
And our director, Noemi Negron, she's had an amazing career outside of Colorado, but she's lived here for 7 years and has mostly worked with bands and has mostly worked in the music scene here with cumbia bands and samba. I believe samba. She's going to listen to this and be like, I don't play samba. But I know cumbia is one of them. But no, she's amazing. She's this incredible artistic vision, and is so incredibly talented. And I hope that she gets to do more shows after this here in town. And even though like I don't go to all the rehearsals, I mean like the whole cast. I mean two of them are people I've only recently gotten to know, but Most of them I've known for some time. And being able to pop in to the theater whenever, and me and Alex, who runs the Buck Theater, like we've started to really connect with each other. And I feel a warmth and a family embrace from them. And I had a really rough last few years, man. Like this year has been a turning point. This year has been almost entirely good, if not great. But prior to that, I did prior to beginning of late March, early April of this year, going back to beginning of 2018 when my friend Patrick died, I've been in the shit and I've been in the barrel. And it was really theater and that community and that connection that you have in theater, that acceptance that you have. Theater is still a home of misfits, whereas the literary world is pretentious assholes. Not all of them, but a lot, so many. And the theater world, not that there aren't pretentious assholes there too, but I would say...
Why, whatever do you mean, Jonathan?
I think you do know what I mean, good sir. So there are definitely plenty of those. But overall, when I go into a theater, I'm going to find at least 2 or 3 people who I'm going to have a great talk with.
Yeah.
I'm going to get a hug from someone. I'm going to get a nod of recognition. I'm going to get a laugh. I'm going to just have a great time when I'm in that space. And I needed that. I really, really needed that in my life, just for my own mental and emotional well-being, but also creatively, because I went a little bit of time not really knowing if I was going to write again, and not knowing if I had any more stories I wanted to tell. And now I do. Now I do have stories I want to tell and things I want to do and projects that I want to make happen that I'm hoping that this play allows me to do.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It seems that you find that freedom in the collaborative process.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. Veronica said to me yesterday when we were changing that scene that I mentioned earlier, and she was like, "No, I know the word is sacred." And I'm like, "No, it's not. No word is sacred. That is a lie." Yeah. It's all about the best words. If we don't have the best words, it needs to change.
Absolutely. Man, Jonathan, we don't have much time. When we get to this stage of the pod, I'd love to ask you, what is your ghost light that you'd leave on for the next generation? And that kind of loosely translates to what is that piece of advice that you wish you had when you started your career that you'd share with people coming up behind you?
It's to be an elder. That's what your goal should be. There's elders and there's old people. And I heard Harvey Fierstein. I heard him on Mark Maron's podcast, and he said this so succinctly, and I loved it. But it's that old people, they've just worked their way up the ranks. They have whatever power they have, and they just want to hold on to it. And they might pay a lot of lip service to the young, but they have no intention of giving up their spot. They don't think about their legacy. They don't think about when they're going to die. They just hold on to all that they have. And they stop any kind of progress from coming. But an elder recognizes that, and you can recognize this from the beginning. You can intentionally do this, even as a young person. When I accomplish things that I'm going to accomplish, when I go through a door, I'm taking that door off its hinges. When I get an opportunity, I'm going to remember all the people who gave me opportunities. And I'm going to remember the people I wanted to give opportunities to. You're not doing this for yourself. That's what an elder knows. You're doing this for all the possible people that you can help. And it doesn't matter how many people, it doesn't matter the scale of that help, if it's just within your neighborhood or if this isn't just the arts. If it's in your neighborhood, if it's in your city, if it's in your state, doesn't matter how big or small. It could be one person. The work that you dedicate your life to should always be in the service of others, ultimately. Not that you don't also look out for yourself and your own like needs and responsibilities, but that's not it. Yeah. And an elder understands that. And an elder understands that you get to a certain point where maybe there's one or two things that you could still accomplish. But what's even more important is that you make sure all those people that you came across, young and old alike, but especially young people. Young people are the ones who, unless they come from money, really have no leg up in this game. And so looking out for them and being like, how can I cultivate what you're trying to do, whether or not I understand it? See, an old person wants to keep things the way they were when their generation was young. Yeah. So they have those same values, those same morals, the same worldviews. An elder understands like, hey, the way that the young think is different than the way I think. And that's how I want to keep it. And that young person is only going to flourish if I embolden them to be themselves. And that is something that you don't have to even get to that stage of being an elder to enact, to start doing. Just, even if you start off at 20 and by 25, you've gotten some opportunities, you've gotten like, say, a really good paid internship at like a theater or at a store or whatever it is that you're working on. And hey, I got a buddy, or even better, I got a buddy whose cousin is like a really good person and they have this particular skill that's needed. Let me put them in touch with my buddy's cousin. Like that's being an elder, even though you're 25.
Yeah.
And what the world needs is more elders, and I'm very fortunate for the elders that have been in my life. I've done my best to be an elder whenever I can be. And I want to continue doing that. I want to continue getting better at it. But also this production wouldn't have happened without some elders. My three producing partners, Kelly McAllister, Patrick Mueller, and Lisa Young. All three of them have been wonderful elders in ushering in this project and ushering in this play. And Alex, especially at the Bug, Alex Weimer, amazing man, amazing stuff that him and the Bug are doing for his community, as well as directly for his neighborhood. And those are the kind of people we need more of.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, John, and so much for that message. I think that's really spot on and quite beautiful. The play is, of course, the play is Puerto Rican Nocturne. It's opening at the Bug when?
August 5th. It'll run to August 21st. And we actually also will be doing dates October 13th through the 16th in Adams County at Factory 55.
Oh, fantastic. Where can we get tickets?
You can get tickets off of the Bug's website. For the August run, we're not selling the ones for October yet.
Okay.
But for the August run, you can get it off the Bug website. You can also check us out on Instagram at PR Nocturne Play. And the link to the tickets is on that site as well.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you so much for joining us today, and really thankful for your time and your candor. It was a great conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Now, Dan, do the damn thing. Anyway, I got a bag of frozen raspberries on the laptop now. We are going to start cooling down.
Man, frozen food is one of my favorite snacks.
Hell yes. I am late to the game of just like throwing them in to things like cereal and letting them cool everything else down. Like they're great frozen.
Yes. No, I've been on a smoothie kick for the last couple of months. It's great. But no, I think the strawberries definitely go to mangoes for me. I love frozen mangoes.
Man, mangoes! I'll tell you, like, I'm not a guy that like seeks them out in any other form but frozen, because that's a nice surprise kick in the smoothie for sure.
Yeah, well, and you know the mangoes and the avocados that you get here, they just don't compare to what you get in the Caribbean.
That's what I hear.
When you're in the tropics, it's like the mangoes are twice the size. Same with the avocados, they're like 2-3 times the size, and they're green, and they're so full of flavor. And it's hard to find that out here.
Yeah, man, we gotta stop. I'm getting hungry all over again.